I walked into my childhood living room and froze. My brother was already speaking, not greeting me, not pausing for my arrival, just talking. He stood near the fireplace with a folder pressed to his chest like a shield, listing funeral details with the tone of someone reading a corporate report. Burial location. Flowers. Everything meticulously planned. My father's name sounded procedural in his mouth, stripped of everything that made it matter. Stripped of love, memory, life. I waited for my name to appear in the conversation. Seconds turned to minutes. Never came. When I finally asked a question, my voice carefully calm, my hands steady despite the trembling in my chest, my brother answered without looking at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the folder. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else touched my arm like I was the disruption, not the daughter who'd just lost her father. The room moved on like I was furniture they'd accidentally bumped into on their way somewhere else. I stood there, surrounded by family, and realized this meeting wasn't missing me by accident. It was designed that way. Planned. Orchestrated. The exclusion wasn't emotional or careless. It was logistical. Deliberate. Efficient. Like I'd already been dead as long as Dad was. Like my presence didn't matter to the future we were supposedly building together. That's when I understood. I didn't just lose my father that day. I lost my place in the family too. And no one even noticed I was grieving. When the meeting ended, no one explained anything. No one pulled me aside and said, "We should have included you." No one apologized. Chairs scraped across the floor like nails on skin. Papers were stacked and filed away with purpose. My brother closed that folder fast. So fast, like I might grab it and see what I wasn't supposed to know. Like my eyes couldn't be trusted with family secrets. Conversations resumed in low tones as people drifted toward the kitchen, toward the door, anywhere but toward me. They moved like water flowing around a stone. I followed them anyway, needing someone to acknowledge what had just happened. I needed to understand why I was here but not really here. I saw the calendar on the wall. Dates circled in red. Finalized. Planned. Decisions already made without my input, without my voice, without even asking if I wanted to be involved. I hadn't missed a meeting. I'd been removed from the process entirely. Deliberately. Before it had even started. My aunt avoided my eyes while pretending to rinse a glass that was already clean. She scrubbed at it like it was the most important thing in the world. My brother laughed at something someone whispered to him. A laugh that felt designed to prove he wasn't uncomfortable, that this was all normal. That excluding his sister from funeral planning was just how things were done now. Grief sat heavy in my chest, but something else settled deeper. Awareness. This wasn't chaos after death. This was order. A system that worked without me. A mechanism I wasn't part of. A plan that had developed in rooms I wasn't invited into. And suddenly, I understood this had started long before today. The exclusion didn't begin when Dad died. It began the moment someone decided I didn't matter enough to include. That night I couldn't sleep. My father's voice replayed in my head, steady and reassuring. He had told me everything was taken care of. At the time, I'd believed him completely. Now those words felt staged, like lines he'd memorized for a role he didn't want to play. Like he was reading from a script someone else had written. I sat on my bed scrolling through old messages, searching for comfort, and found confusion instead. The more I read, the more confused I became. Missed calls that were never returned. Invitations that arrived too late, long after decisions had been made. Conversations that ended abruptly when my brother entered the room, like someone had flipped a switch. I remembered seeing a document on my father's desk months ago, half covered by mail. When I asked about it, he smiled and changed the subject. I'd accepted that smile as peace. Now it felt like a curtain being drawn, like a door closing between us. I wasn't grieving blindly anymore. I was remembering with clarity. Crystal clear memories that suddenly made sense in a new light. And once I noticed the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. It was everywhere. In every interaction. In every conversation that ended too quickly. in every decision made without me. My erasure hadn't begun with death. It had been rehearsed long before, practiced, perfected. Someone had been training me to disappear for years, and I'd been cooperating without knowing what I was agreeing to, without knowing the game that was being played. I realized then that this wasn't accident or carelessness. This was strategy, calculated, intentional, planned with precision. And strategy could be countered, if I was smart enough to see it. The next morning my brother texted me. Not a question. Instructions. Cold, direct orders delivered through a screen. Arrive at 10 a.m. Sit in the back. If anyone asks you anything, just say we had it handled. I stared at the screen, stunned by how calmly he'd reduced me to a background role. Like I was an extra in a film about my own family. Prop. Furniture. Something to fill a seat but not to be heard from. I typed a response. Angry words, hurt words, deleted it and chose silence instead. Silence gave me space to think. Space to understand what was happening. I realized something important. If I pushed back now, I would look emotional, difficult, unstable. That label would spread fast in this family. They would say I was grieving too hard, not thinking clearly, being irrational. So I played the part they assigned me. Quiet, cooperative, invisible. And while they mistook my silence for surrender, I started paying attention to how information moved, how power flowed, who spoke to whom, who checked with my brother before answering questions, who looked nervous when I entered a room. Power had shifted in this family, and it wasn't recent. I just hadn't noticed when it happened. I'd been so focused on my own life, on my own world, that I missed the coup entirely. I'd been so focused on grieving that I didn't see the takeover happening right in front of me. At the funeral, stories were told about my father that felt incomplete, selective, curated by someone with an agenda. My brother stood confidently near the casket, speaking as if he were the sole witness to my father's entire life. He talked about decisions we made together, plans Dad discussed with me, memories only I know about. I sat still, hands folded, listening to a version of events that erased me so completely. I started wondering if I'd imagined my own relationship with him. Had I imagined the conversations we'd had, the advice he'd given me, the plans we'd made together? People nodded along, absorbing his narrative. They didn't know what was missing because they'd never known me to be there. They only knew what my brother told them. After the service, condolences were directed toward my brother first. Always first. Someone told me, "You're so strong." Like strength was my only remaining contribution to this family. Like being strong meant disappearing gracefully. I realized then that grief was being used as camouflage. No one questioned authority during mourning. No one asked hard questions when someone was crying. And my brother knew it. He understood the power of grief. He used it like a weapon. He wore sorrow like armor, and behind it, he controlled the narrative completely. He shaped the story. He decided what people remembered about my father. He decided what people knew about the family. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't interrupt. I stored every sentence away, knowing the truth doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. Weight gathers weight. It becomes stronger as time passes. And eventually, it becomes impossible to ignore. The truth always surfaces if you're patient enough to wait for it. A week later, I returned to my father's house to collect personal items. My brother wasn't there. He trusted that I would follow the rules, that I would be obedient, that I would disappear quietly like I was supposed to, that I would accept my erasure without fighting back. While sorting through drawers in my father's study, I found it. A copy of a will older than the one my brother had referenced. This version included me clearly, explicitly, remembered, real, listed as a beneficiary, acknowledged as a daughter. I felt my pulse slow instead of spike. My hands were steady as I held the document. This wasn't chaos. This was evidence. This was proof that my father had remembered me, that he had cared about me, that I mattered to him. I photographed every page, noting dates, signatures, witnesses. The ink was steady, legitimate, professional, no mistakes, no ambiguity. My brother hadn't mentioned this document because it complicated his version of events. It proved that my father had remembered me, that he had planned for me, that I wasn't an afterthought or a mistake. I placed everything back exactly as I'd found it. No confrontation, no accusation, no drama, just confirmation. The exclusion was strategic, not emotional. And strategy could be countered if I was smart enough, patient enough, and brave enough to try. As I left the house that afternoon, I understood something crucial. My father hadn't erased me. Someone else had done that after he died. Someone with an agenda. Someone who wanted power and control. And that distinction mattered more than anything else. I stopped asking questions altogether. No more, why wasn't I included? No more requests for updates. No more attempts to understand the logic of my own erasure. I simply stopped engaging. I disappeared into silence like I was supposed to. My brother grew comfortable in that quiet. He started talking freely around me, assuming I wasn't listening anymore. Assuming I'd accepted my new role as the silent family member. The invisible one. At a family dinner, he mentioned legal meetings casually, like background noise. He listed locations and dates without thinking. I nodded and smiled. Inside, I documented everything. Locations. Every detail. I created a timeline in my mind, linking events together, seeing the pattern. Silence made people careless. They filled it with truth without realizing it. They assumed that if I wasn't speaking, I wasn't paying attention. They didn't understand that silence was my greatest tool. My brother enjoyed control, but he enjoyed validation more. He wanted to be seen as responsible, dependable, the hero who stepped up after Dad died, the son who handled everything, the man of the family. And heroes hate being questioned, so I let him perform. I attended family gatherings and stayed quiet. I let relatives praise him while I observed how often his stories changed depending on the audience. Small inconsistencies. Harmless on their own. Dangerous when documented. Dangerous when connected together into a larger pattern. I wasn't building revenge. I was building clarity. I was building a case made of truth. And clarity has a way of dismantling lies without raising its voice. Truth doesn't need to shout. Just needs to be heard. The first crack appeared at a family gathering 3 months after the funeral. A distant cousin asked me about a decision my brother claimed I supported. I smiled politely and said, "That's the first I'm hearing of it." Not accusatory, just factual, just honest. The room shifted slightly. A pause that everyone felt but no one acknowledged. My brother laughed too fast, too loud, correcting me gently. "Of course you agreed. We all discussed it." But his eyes flickered. They betrayed him. He hadn't anticipated me speaking at all. He'd built his entire plan on my silence, and I'd just broken the first rule. That moment was small, but it lingered in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Afterward, he pulled me aside and reminded me we were a team. I agreed. Loud. Inside I recognized fear. Not of me but of exposure. He didn't need my cooperation. He needed my silence. He needed me to validate his lies by not contradicting them. And for the first time he wasn't sure he had it anymore. I went home that night knowing patience was working. Truth doesn't rush. It waits until lies get comfortable enough to stumble. Until the liar gets confident enough to slip up. And my brother was getting very, very comfortable. He was starting to believe his own narrative. My brother called a family meeting under the guise of closure, healing, unity, moving forward together. He used words like family, understanding, and love as if they meant something. As if they hadn't been weapons in his hands. I arrived early and took a seat near the edge of the room. He positioned himself at the center, papers in hand, already prepared. The conversation quickly turned administrative. responsibilities, timelines. What Dad would have wanted. Every sentence centered him as the sole interpreter of my father's intentions. Only he knew what Dad wanted. Only he understood the family's needs. I watched faces around the room. Some skeptical. Some relieved not to think too deeply. Some confused about decisions that didn't add up but didn't want to rock the boat. When he asked if anyone had concerns, the pause felt deliberate. Heavy. I could have spoken. I had evidence. Had questions. But instead I said nothing. That silence unnerved him more than confrontation would have. He didn't know what I was thinking. He couldn't read my face. He filled it by talking more, over-explaining. Correcting himself mid-sentence. Contradicting earlier statements. Actually, that's not what I meant. What I meant was. By the end of the meeting, nothing was resolved, but something had shifted. People left confused instead of comforted. And confusion is the beginning of questions. The seed of doubt had been planted. It was taking root. A few days later, my aunt called me quietly. She didn't accuse anyone. She asked careful questions instead, like someone untangling a knot. She was fishing for information. I answered honestly without emotion or drama. I answered like I was simply recounting facts. I shared the existence of the older will, not as a weapon but as a fact. I found it while collecting Dad's things. I thought you should know it exists. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear her breathing. I could feel her thinking. She admitted she'd felt uneasy about how quickly decisions were made after my father's death. She wasn't ready to confront my brother, but she was listening now. She was paying attention. She was starting to see the pattern too. That was enough. More than enough. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't building a case in isolation. The truth had witnesses. Real ones. People who cared about my father and wanted to honor his actual wishes. People who were starting to understand that something wasn't right. My brother's confidence depended on the belief that everyone accepted his version. That everyone trusted him. That belief was cracking. And he didn't know where the fracture had started. He didn't know his sister was documenting everything. He didn't know his aunt was asking questions. He didn't know the family was beginning to doubt. The foundation of his control was more fragile than he realized. It was built on sand, not stone. Time passed, and sympathy faded like old photographs left in the sun. 6 months became a year. The immediate grief that had blanketed everything started to lift. Without grief as cover, my brother's control felt abrupt instead of necessary. People began asking why decisions were rushed. Why certain documents were never shared with the full family. Why some people had been excluded from meetings that affected everyone's future. He responded with irritation masked as authority. That tone didn't land the way it used to. Authority requires respect, and respect requires transparency. He had neither anymore. At a small gathering, someone asked me directly how I felt about being excluded from planning. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't cry or rage or demand apologies. I said simply, it surprised me. The simplicity unsettled them more than anger would have. If I'd been angry, they could dismiss me as emotional. But I was calm. I was measured. I was stating facts. My brother interrupted quickly, reframing the situation. It was a practical decision. We didn't want to burden her during grief. But interruptions draw attention. And attention invites scrutiny. People started asking follow-up questions. Questions he couldn't answer clearly without contradicting himself again. I realized then that I didn't need to expose him loudly. I just needed to stop protecting him with my silence at strategic moments. I just needed to tell the truth. Stories began to clash publicly. My brother would say one thing, only to be gently corrected by someone who remembered differently. Not aggressively, casually. The kind of correction that can't be dismissed as emotional or bitter. Actually, I think it was the other way around. I was there when your father mentioned it. I watched his posture change over weeks. Shoulders tighter. Smile forced. He started double-checking himself mid-sentence, second-guessing his own narrative. Well, I think. Or maybe it was. The confidence that had carried him for months was crumbling. Power that relies on performance is fragile. It shatters when the audience stops applauding. The family wasn't choosing sides yet. They were noticing inconsistencies. And once people start noticing, they start remembering. Old conversations resurfaced. Old promises my father had made. Old plans that contradicted what my brother was telling them now. I stayed consistent. Factual. I didn't demand recognition. I let it return to me naturally, like something that had always belonged to me. 'Cause it did. During a dinner, someone asked why I wasn't listed as a contact on an important document. The question wasn't hostile. It was curious, reasonable. That seems strange. Shouldn't she be listed? My brother hesitated. Just a second too long. A pause that lasted an eternity. He answered vaguely, blaming oversight. Administrative oversight. These things happen in the paperwork. But oversights don't repeat this consistently. You don't forget the same person twice by accident. You forget them on purpose. Everyone in the room understood that. They felt it. The lie was so obvious that it hung in the air like a bad smell. The room felt different after that. Not explosive. Just alert. Like something had shifted and everyone had felt it move. Like the ground had changed beneath their feet. I met my brother's eyes briefly. He looked away first. He couldn't hold my gaze anymore. And I knew the balance had shifted irrevocably. My aunt shared the older will with 2 other relatives. Not dramatically. Privately. Only. Like someone sharing a concern, not ammunition. I found this and thought we should know about it. Reactions were controlled but unmistakable. Concern replaced certainty. Questions replaced acceptance. Why wasn't this mentioned? What else are we not being told? My brother wasn't confronted immediately. People wanted to understand first. They wanted to gather information before acting. That delay worked in my favor. He continued operating under the assumption that control was intact. That everything was under his command. It wasn't. He was moving pieces on a board that was already being rearranged behind him. He was playing chess while everyone else was learning the rules of a different game. My brother sensed something slipping. He became defensive, correcting people preemptively. He inserted himself into conversations he wasn't invited to join. Actually, that's not how it happened. Let me explain what really occurred. That behavior raised alarms. Authority doesn't need to insist. Simply exist. His didn't anymore. He had to fight for every inch of credibility. The family began discussing matters without him. Quiet side conversations at gatherings. Did you hear about? Decisions were delayed while they consulted with each other instead of accepting his word. His phone calls weren't returned as quickly. His emails were read but not answered immediately. The rhythm of communication shifted. He was no longer the hub through which all information flowed. His grip weakened visibly. And he knew it was happening but couldn't stop it. He was losing control and there was nothing he could do to stop the fall. A formal family discussion was called, this time with neutral oversight, a lawyer who specialized in estate matters. My brother arrived prepared with documents and explanations. He was ready for battle. I arrived with photographs of the older will, timelines meticulously documented, and careful notes. No accusations, just facts, just evidence. The room listened, carefully. His interruptions were noted. His explanations felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced them but didn't believe them anymore. The lawyer asked questions he couldn't answer definitively. How did this older will come to be excluded from the current proceedings? My brother's face went pale. Contradictions were laid side by side. Not by me alone. By others. By the evidence. By time itself. By the paper trail of lies. My brother's story fractured under its own weight. Pieces of his narrative didn't fit together. Dates didn't align. Details contradicted each other. He looked smaller. Not angry. Suppose. Like someone who'd been wearing armor that suddenly wasn't there anymore. The protection he'd built had crumbled. The room didn't erupt. Settled into understanding. Everyone understood what had happened. Everyone saw the truth now. No one shouted. No one celebrated. No one said, "I told you so." Responsibilities were reassigned quietly. Transparency was demanded going forward. Decisions would require family input. Documents would be shared. My name would be on important papers. My voice would be heard. My brother wasn't removed from the family. He was removed from unchecked authority. That distinction mattered. He was still family, but he was no longer in charge. No longer trusted with power. He didn't lose everything. Just control. Trust shifted like tectonic plates. Conversations no longer centered him. People didn't laugh at his jokes the same way. They didn't call him first with news. When he spoke, people listened differently. They listened with skepticism instead of acceptance. That was the real consequence. Reputation doesn't collapse loudly. It erodes, slowly, visibly, until one day you realize no one respects you anymore. They tolerate you but they don't respect you. He apologized privately. Carefully worded. Almost rehearsed like he'd practiced it in the mirror. "I'm sorry if things didn't work out as planned. I was just trying to help." The words felt empty. Hello. I could see the shame in his eyes, but I also saw the calculation. He was apologizing because he had to, not because he truly understood what he'd done. He was sorry he'd been caught. I accepted it calmly anyway. Acceptance isn't endorsement. It's closure. I didn't need him to suffer endlessly. I just needed him to understand that his actions had consequences. That I wasn't invisible. I wasn't reinserted into the family. I reclaimed space naturally. My voice carried weight again. Without force. Without demand. Just presence. People asked my opinion on decisions. My father's wishes were reconsidered with me in the room. My inheritance was restored. My place at the table was real again. For the first time in over a year, I felt like I could breathe normally. The weight that had been sitting on my chest since that day in the living room finally began to lift. Meals became easier. Family gatherings felt less like battlegrounds. I could laugh without wondering if anyone was judging me. I could speak without measuring every word for consequences. And that was worth more than any revenge could ever have been. The family adapted. Healthier. Slower. More transparent. Silence had done its work. The damage was repaired not with grand gestures, but with small changes. Regular meetings. Shared responsibility. Respect for each other's voices. Change didn't happen overnight. It was gradual. But the important thing was that we were no longer hiding from the truth. We were facing it together. My brother had to rebuild trust from scratch. Every financial decision he made was scrutinized. It was uncomfortable for him. But that discomfort was necessary. That accountability was what our family had been missing. We'd been taught to avoid conflict, to keep peace at any cost. Now we were learning a different way. My father would have approved of this version of our family. With lies stripped away, I understood my father better. His intentions were never exclusion. They were peace. He had wanted me protected, provided for, remembered. As I sorted through my father's personal effects, I found letters he'd written but never sent. One letter was addressed to me. It was dated just 3 weeks before he died. In it, he told me how proud he was of me. He told me I was stronger than I realized. He told me that if something ever happened to him, I should stand firm in what I believed in. "Don't let anyone convince you that you don't belong," he wrote. "You matter. Never forget that." He had known. Somehow, he had sensed what was coming. And he had tried to prepare me for it. I cried for the first time since his death. Not from grief but from understanding. My father had given me permission to stand up for myself. I released the role of the overlooked daughter. No longer fit. I was no longer the person my brother had tried to make me. I was the person my father had always seen. The silence I'd maintained during those dark months served its purpose. It allowed me to observe, to document, to understand. But I didn't need that silence anymore. I didn't need to be invisible. I started speaking up at family gatherings. Not aggressively, just with honesty. When something wasn't right, I said so. When I disagreed, I voiced my opinion. I also let go of the anger I'd been carrying. I realized that holding on to it was only hurting me. I could forgive my brother, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved the peace that forgiveness brings. Forgiveness doesn't mean what he did was okay. It just means I'm no longer willing to let it define me. I wasn't erased anymore. Not because I fought loudly. Not because I destroyed him or humiliated him publicly. But because I stood still long enough for the truth to surface. I learned that the most powerful revenge isn't the one you orchestrate. It's the one that orchestrates itself. The truth doesn't need your help. Just needs your silence, the right kind of silence. The kind that lets people reveal themselves. The kind that documents patterns. The kind that waits patiently for the right moment. My brother lost control not because I took it from him, but because he was never strong enough to hold it. His control was built on performance and lies. And performance always eventually falters. I got my life back not because I fought for it, but because I stopped pretending I'd never had it. And that's a victory that tastes like peace. Like justice. Like finally being able to breathe again after holding your breath for so long. Looking back now, I don't regret my silence. It taught me that strength isn't always about speaking loudly. Sometimes it's about knowing when to speak, what to say, and when to let the truth speak for itself. I discovered that I had power I didn't know I possessed. The power of patience, observation, and unwavering faith in what is true. The erasure was over. And I was whole again. More than whole. I was transformed.